second session that we got already a big preview in the previous session with Ionat Zur that we invited to talk in the morning because of the time difference. This second panel is dedicated to the discussions about how we should deal and what are the problems with dealing with biomaterials and the artworks using them. This panel is going to be led by Jens Hausner, and I'm inviting Jens to introduce our first speaker.
Yeah, good afternoon. I'm quite amazed by the way that this session is filmed. It's a kind of mise en abîme, like we say in French. And this kind of overlaying of different kind of layers of reflection that is self-referential at the same time is, of course, pointing to very quality of mediality. And a lot of art festivals around the world have been called unstable. We have the V2 Institute for Unstable Media. We had the Article Biennale in Norway about unstable media. So there is a kind of instability that is inherent in all the reflections when it comes to biomedia art, its reflection, its staging, its conservation in archiving. And this is very much in line with the next afternoon session, which is after establishing the field in a little way this morning with first case studies and pioneers in the field. Caring for the field comes next. And we have on board a very important duo here, not only from the Balkans, but from Europe in general, that have been very prominently featuring this art since a long time. So namely Olga Meichen-Lin and Sunčica Ostojić. And so Olga is a curator and theoretician that graduated in art history, comparative literature, and social science at the University of Zagreb, Croatia, doing amazing curatorial work since 2002 through this NGO, this container that most of us are probably familiar with, and most of us have hopefully visited at least once. And so Olga is also working at the VN Gallery since 2003 in Zagreb, and has been in charge of not less than 120 exhibitions. Not less experienced in exhibition making is Sunčica, also a cultural worker from Zagreb, also graduated in art history and philosophy, and currently a PhD candidate in Belgrade at the Faculty of Media and Communications. So we come back to our previous discussion about in how far we have to shape this field in terms of media theory and not just in terms of aliveness. So Sunčica is also a guest lecturer at the Academy of Fine Arts in Zagreb, and she is also the co-founder of Container and has been also involved in projects that probably a lot of us know about, such as extravagant bodies, displacing the very notions of bodies should be defined as. The memorable Touch Me Festival I have been personally able to attend, device art, and also she's the initiator of the DIY Art Lab since 2000 and has also created around 100 exhibitions. And so, yeah, I would have been very much liking and looking forward to meet in person and to have not only kind of flat 2D, but a 3D or 4D experience, but at least, yeah, welcome, and I'm very happy to hear you and know what's new and to discuss with you and the audience afterwards. So please welcome Olga and Sunčica.
Well, good afternoon, my all dear invisible friends and colleagues. In this presentation, we will elaborate on curatorial challenges and dilemmas which define a course for building protocols and standards for exhibiting biomedia in artistic context. We are considering some practical issues encountered in our own curatorial practice of our curatorial colleagues, and also theoretical research in the field of biomedia. As in any new media introduced to art, there is no specific curatorial education about the field of biotechnological art, and no generally established and accepted guidelines on how to deal with challenges of exhibiting biological materials and living beings. Well, therefore, each encounter with exhibiting and presenting biotechnological art is almost a pioneer work. So protocols and standards could be an aid to make it more feasible and acceptable.
Art containing living or semi-living entities encompasses a few unique issues regarding its exhibiting that is organized around its physiology. We discuss problems of exhibiting life within the art context and dealing with physiological problems in art context. And these are not the same as in scientific context, because science is regarded usually as very objective, even though art is often exposing it as a social construct. So in that, we detected 4 groups of problems. So the first group, the first issue is instability, changeability, virality, mortality of biotechnological art, also maintaining it and controlling the life itself before, during, and after the exhibition. Then the second group of problems is legality of artistic work and practice. And that's another complex problem, intervening and manipulating life. Then the third problem that we are going to briefly discuss in this presentation is ethical perspective of exhibiting hybrid art. And the last topic is the cultural institutional relation and approach to the audience. In other words, communicating biotechnological practice, health and safety. And these main issues are the basis of developing standards and protocols. And we have to say that this is something connected to the institutional or organizational view, curatorial view on exhibiting by art.
In few selected points, features of biomedia projects include instability, changeability, virality, mortality of life, which impacts preparation, setup, and maintenance phase of the exhibited artwork. Then, biotechnological art projects require specific disposal methods. They are also may initiate identification process so that the personnel can develop affective or emotional attachment. The projects tend to be controversial, and they require interdisciplinary collaborations while in institutional care.
Exhibiting biological materials and living beings is one of the most challenging aspects for curators in any type of art institution, be that independent or public. Because of the instability, changeability, and virality of life processes, exhibiting life is demanding different kinds of maintenance. In our practice, we had a lot of situations where things in maintaining the artwork alive have gone south. For example, I know that Marta de Menezes is there, so I'm going to talk about exhibiting a few times her work. For example, when we were doing the immortality for 2-piece, that was somehow contaminated and started developing some kind of fungi during the process of exhibiting. And when we were exhibiting her butterfly piece, Nature, we, for example, got the caterpillars probably too early, and they started turning to butterflies, and the exhibition was not even ready to be installed. So that timing of getting them was completely off. Also, Polona, I know that she's there. her project Interestimity confronts the observer with fauna and flora that she can find in the bathroom and in some other common spaces. And she was using these microcultures from public sites, and they're very easily multiplying in enormous quantities. But in our exhibition space, during the exhibition, that didn't happen. But a few years later, when we went, that was the old historical architecture that was not used for anything, especially not for exhibitions. After that, we went to the space where she was exhibiting, and those cultures were trying. So the question is, what should institutional protocol include in these kind of cases? We can, for example, foresee the possible problems and solutions with this kind of unstable artworks. Also, we can develop risk management protocol of the artwork and performer to try to increase survival chance of the artwork in transport, setup, maintenance, or performer while performing risky or dangerous activity. Or we can also develop standards for terminating the artwork if that's needed. And the photo or the slide that you're seeing, I know that Jens was already talking about it, art orienté objet, and those curatorial projects. Made a horse live in me, I think is a very, very good example of how it can be somehow prevented and prepared for in terms of testing, medical professionals being present, ER, on standby, and all biotechnological conditions for this type of work that is very risky for the artist being in place. In addition to the basic tech rider, we created a draft list of what can also help with the exhibiting. For example, detailed questionnaire for life maintenance of artwork while in institutional care, from the phase of transport to taking down, as for example is proposed for performance arts. What kind of knowledge, sensitivity, and responsibility is required for a life, and how it can be shared inside of the institution or organization, or what skills, what obligations, what kind of space is adequate in technical way, or maintenance conditions, what maintenance conditions are required. Then also precise timing in handling life, precautions to be taken and conduct of the production and maintenance team, defining responsibility between artist and institution, then defining institution standards to the form of exhibiting, artwork, original state, documentation, representation. So this is the list of some things that can help with exhibiting.
Disposal, a very interesting topic. Well, life itself holds a kind of paradox. It has an universally recognized intrinsic value, especially within an artwork, but there is also another side. For example, a life of the sheep, before they become part of an artwork, like in project of Siniša Labrović you see on the slide, has a minimal value. They are just plain sheep to be bred for food and slaughtered. But when they become an artwork, their value radically increases and is read in a different code. So, in artistic context, the automatization of ethical codes and social contract about life as food takes place, in this case of animals, and every life becomes valuable. Because of that, disposal is a quite particular topic in curatorial practice of biotech art. Disposal in science labs, for example, does not come in question, but in the art context, it provokes affective reactions and raises ethical questions. We know there are usually few options to deal with life after the exhibition. We can sustain it or we can terminate it. If we sustain it, then it could be, for example, returned to the lab or other institution it has been borrowed from, or it can be put in nature, or it can become a pet. I suppose we all have at home some unexpected and extraordinary pets from various art projects, like a freshwater elephant-nosed fish native to Africa from the artwork of Andy Gracie, visible on the slide. But regardless of the approach, it is to be defined by the exhibiting institution who decides what happens to the artwork after the exhibition. So is it the artist, is it the institution, or both? What precise steps are to be taken with life, and what are the accepted consequences of that? It should be also known what is termination and how to perform it. In our experience, some artists are concerned with these issues, but not all of them. But institution does not have a choice but to take care of living matter after the show closes. So there should be some kind of protocol for live disposal. Further, dealing with life and art subjects has a different affective consequences than with other kinds of art objects. Affect and intensity arise because of, as Mitchell argues, specularization of authentic life in the exhibition space. So affective reactions or emotional attachment had been observed to occur with curators, technicians, and other exhibition personnel. We personally noticed and experienced the same phenomenon in the works involving vertebrae, but also other living beings, as well as semi-living. So, for example, Špela Petrić cute rats you can see, Marta de Menezes lovely butterflies, adorable sheep of Siniša Labrović, and so on, all has this kind of effect. So, and what to do with the guidelines and protocols about that? Well, first, besides practical and intellectual labor that is immanent to every exhibition, emotional labor of the personnel should be acknowledged. And it would be important to establish some kind of guidelines for generally dealing with these kind of emotional involvements during, of course, and after exhibition, especially if there is an extreme action or event involved.
So, controversy, this is the title of this slide. That's a very frequent occurrence in bioart. And it, for example, happened in the reality show Folk HR from Siniša Labrović. That was a multimedia art project that was trying to make a parody of the reality show platform. And he chose sheep as non-individualized representatives of the species. And what he wanted to do is to try to make one of them become a star. And there was one conflicting part of the project where spectators were bearing responsibility on two levels. First, as voters, because they were awarded a sheep that they voted out. And then the second phase was if they didn't want it, if they were living in the animal protection organization, could decide to spend 24 hours with that sheep in the same space. And of course, this work ended up on the evening newspapers on the front page as very scandalous reality with the title, "Choose Your Lamb for Killing." So one of the main questions that we can derive from that experience is, can we optimize controversy so that the artist and institution make best of it. Because controversy is necessary for this kind of art projects, raising public debate and making art going out of the standard framework of its institution, but can also have very negative feedback and effect on the life from one side of the artist and also well-being of the institution. So what should this protocol for controversy include? So in our opinion, for the institution to be prepared, it should provide broader contextualization of the artwork, define how do curators and institution PR system deals with controversy and possible dangerous outcomes of controversial biotech art, then advocate for the artwork and educate about the artwork, set rules how to protect the reputation of the institution from the negative public image, or, for example, financial difficulties of losing support. Think about support system for facilitating quality media communication or art public support, how to develop national or international institutional network. For example, that was very helpful in the case of Steve Kurtz, that global network that helped him from raising the money to dealing with controversy of what happened and so on. So the structure should be responsibly set. Also interdisciplinarity. So biomedia depend upon interdisciplinary set of knowledge and skills, and it's related on interdisciplinary collaborations for artwork exhibiting and maintenance, also for creating, but this is not our topic. So what should that protocol include? Guidelines should encompass how to involve experts in all stages of exhibiting and a list of possible scientific partners, then developing global science and art networking, then constant education of curatorial team and technical team and other staff members. Interdisciplinarity can be invisible in the exhibition, but institutions should be held standard of supporting interdisciplinarity in display, for example, by crediting all the scientific work and scientific institutions and scientists that are involved in the project, in all the communication about that artwork.
Legality. Well, legal issues are manifold and they can shift focus from the artwork, but also, as you know, emphasize the very issues the artist is critical towards. They are, of course, cause of numerous complications and obstacles in exhibiting artwork, as, for example, in the project of Belgrade-based artist Zoran Todorovic. Well, his well-known dish made out of the remains from the plastic surgeries is offered to the audience for consuming. And while exhibiting it, in some European countries, we witnessed complete focus to the legality of his artwork. Main concerns were, is it legal to use human tissue? How was it obtained? Is cannibalism legal? And it was a really heated debate. Just a footnote, in Europe, cannibalism is not illegal. So cultural institutions should have established collaboration with legal advisors, which are versed in specific issues, because they are often needed. It should know which permissions or licenses are needed for exhibiting cells, plants, animal, human remains, and how to acquire them. Define how to handle hazardous materials or materials that can be destroyed or contaminated by the public or by the staff. They should also state their general position and position of the institution to legal risk. Define who is responsible if anything happens to the artist, institutional personnel, or audience. And it's directly connected to the used materials. It should also define a general position of the institution to censorship, because censorship can become an internal issue if, for example, there is a matter of illegality of the material used, or if the artwork provokes some illegal actions. But there also can be, of course, external censorship. We saw with Siniša Labrović, animal rights activist, who went berserk and wanted to close the artwork. And also general public can, for some reasons, demand the artwork to be removed.
Ethics, so blind spot of simplified explanation of life, where it is viewed from the perspective of particularity of natural sciences like genetics, results in seeing the secret of life as safe in the hands of scientists. Political, social, contextual, networked aspects of life are disregarded and somehow made irrelevant. The field of biotech art is, because of that injustice, so to say, very much focused on the status of scientific institutions. Ethical issues of new techno-scientific constructions can be transformative because they bring new knowledge. Important ethical question in biomedia art is precisely the production of knowledge. Critical approach to socially accepted safe zone, like science, is inherited to biotechnological art. Main issue connected to the artwork is how does institution create context and communicate to the public subversive instrumentalization of living matter entities and manipulating, exhibiting new species for artistic and non-scientific purpose. So the question of protocol in terms of ethics. So protocol includes how to reduce risk when supporting subversive and ethically provocative artworks. If there is a danger for artist, personnel, or audience, collaboration with medical experts, scientists, and scientific institutions is a must for ensuring ethical process, although that is probably not always possible. Guidelines for caring of different life entities is also something that needs to be thought of.
Theoretician Erika Fischer-Lichte states that artists are no longer godlike creators of the work, of the art. Artists instead established similar conditions to laboratory researches to which they expose themselves and the others. But those conditions are not completely controllable, so the public finds itself in a liminal position which has also a transformable potential. Liminality of the audience brings us to the topic of creating conditions for informed and protected audience as an important part of art institutions' mission. Hence, high standards for audience relations and health and safety are to be considered. Biotechnological art is often provocative and complex in conceptual and scientific aspects. It engages audience, generating internal and external conflict, but also opens door to the risks and uncertainty. Having such an impact, it should be determined how to properly and accurately communicate issues and exhibition narrative. So, for example, communication guidelines should be made for diverse audience, including responsibility to have understandable and informed exhibition labels, notifying visitors about presence of biological materials on site, for example, or beforehand, and defined approach for addressing reactions, negative reactions of the public or actions on site.
So health and safety, that's also a very important and interesting topic, and it's ambivalent problem regarding protocols, considering that, because we are talking about the audience. So, for example, if we mention again this work of Zoran Todorović's simulation that was going around different states in Europe, it was performed almost everywhere. In Germany, it was the biggest question was, is that legal to eat human flesh? But in UK was the only country basically that health and safety rules were the main issue, and he was not able to perform there or to offer to the audience to taste the dish, because the audience was protected by their rules and he couldn't make an A test for that dish. So also the other example of this health and safety rules is a recent piece of Margarita Pevere that she was producing with container, where she was using cells from her womb. And Ars Electronica wanted to exhibit that piece, but they also had her go through the tests, some gynecologic tests for if she is positive for certain bacteria, and she at the time had urinary infection, and because she was positive for bacteria, she was not able to exhibit that art piece at Ars Electronica. Also, on the other side, we have example of Isabel Burrati, for example, that is using, she's making this farm with females, and they are harvesting their bodily juices to produce beauty care products. And she's trying to raise questions of exploitation and sexuality, and also she's selling those products or giving them away, and people are able to use them as creams or cosmetics or tablets. They're made of menstruation or other bodily juices. Also, Silvio Vujicic made his work perfume out of fluids and excrements produced by human body, and these were from urine, saliva, vomit, blood, and sperm, and audience can use those perfumes afterwards. So there is on one side a question how to protect the art piece from the audience, and the other question is how to protect the audience and how to actually establish protocol for these kind of examples. Like Adam Zaretsky, potion from cocoa butter and DNA of salmon sperm that he made and gave it to his audience. So the protocol could be to inform the audience about possible effects of the artwork, to make the audience decide from themselves and sign the permission of some sort, legal permission of being part of the artwork, also ensuring that protocols don't prevent exhibiting the artwork.
Well, to start summing up, development of exhibiting standards and protocols for exhibiting biomedia should be based on few fundamental criteria, and we started to list some of them. So, shared biocare in approach to life in line with the artistic concept. That should be a concern of all the involved parties, with the aim to maintain what Jens Hauser calls presence and aliveness, the performative nature of the biotechnological work. The goal would be of that standards and protocols to ensure liveliness. Next, if needed, ending existence of the biological entity should be done in a contextually most appropriate way. The goal would be ethical approach. Following criteria would be responsible risk-taking, which should not limit or censor artistic concept. This might be a challenge for some institutions, especially public, since risk management is one of their prime objectives, but maybe life should be an exception. So standards and protocols should also reduce the risk for curators, exhibition space, and the artist, or at least give the institution impression that the risks are diminished, and also give them security that all is under control, although it may not be the case. So the goal would be to ensure safety. And last for now would be exhibiting artwork should be done in its original state. The goal would be to ensure authenticity.
So we are closing the presentation with opening a set of questions for further research and discussion. So the main question here is, do we need standards and protocols for biomedia? We were listening a little bit of earlier discussion, and I guess the answer to that would be more no than yes, but we should consider that because biotech field can be much broadly exhibited if the protocols exist. So arguments for standards and protocols, biomedia often demand more direct and constant human care and monitoring than non-living media. And these protocols and standards could make the process manageable. Although standards and protocols can generate many challenges to the organization of the exhibiting process as guidelines, they would benefit all and be useful and valuable to art institutions which have no experience in presenting biomedia. Further, as basic set of recommendations and instructions in order to be prepared for exhibiting biomedia and for ensuring high exhibiting standards, professional growth, and adequate presentation and recognition of biomedia in any interested institution, private, civic, or public. Also, standards and protocol would serve the goal of biotech art to become equally recognized as part of the contemporary art world and illustrate that it is not outside the norms of exhibiting. And then we also have arguments against standards and protocols, that protocols can disrupt or prevent realization of the exhibition rather than make it easier in terms of endless Kafkian administration or high expenses. Then standards and protocol can be rigid and just be the justification for not taking risk and not supporting a valuable artwork. Also, standards and protocol open the question of control. Control should be balanced, so it's not limiting or excessive.
Final question we pose is, why are there no internationally recognized guidelines and standards already in place? Well, as opposed to the contemporary art and its well-established infrastructure and resources, biotechnological art does not systematically develop its exhibition platforms and standards. Of course, it's a young form of art. But there are also not many written documents regarding how to exhibit it. And that can pose an issue, because that is the basis for expansion, and that should reach exhibiting institutions outside new media art scene. Thus, the biotech art is still not capable of large-scale knowledge systematization and distribution, and stays in that way detached. That prevents it to become related and interconnected to already established museums and gallery exhibition standards, and position itself even more globally. Besides, there is a rhetoric argument present about the uniqueness of each biotechnological artwork, which should be approached only individually, and the general guidelines and rules would not be beneficial for these kind of projects. Well, this we can also see just as an excuse, an evasion, which disables broader transfer of know-how and networking. Because we really do have to have in mind something very simple. That is that the knowledge we have, people who have been working with it for a long time, is not a universal knowledge, and it should be transferred. From the very beginning of the biotechnological art, it has been discussed how to present it professionally. Well, this will not be possible in this large scale. This will not be possible without some kind of knowledge formalization and collaboration with international gallery or museum associations. So maybe we should strongly consider a more proactive position and start drafting guidelines and protocols to set the ground rules, at least for exhibiting live, in order to make it more accessible. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this very inspiring talk. And we have the questions and answer at the round table later. So we'll bundle them. And I think there's a lot of connections to what Marta de Menezes is talking about now, because it's not only about the transmission, it's also about what are the spaces, what is the offsite, what is the actual implementation beyond art spaces, how to transmit these experiences and so on, and also how to bring back the gained knowledge to other areas. And we have here a talk by Marta de Menezes about rural curating, about how to bring back in a certain way the isolated, extractive, biotechnological isolation in a petri dish back to a kind of more ecological approach, bringing it back to a kind of milieu perspective. So the talk that we are going to hear is about Cultivamos Cultura, contemporary art space for experimentation in contemporary art, but in a rural part of south of Portugal. And of course, we have not been waiting only for COVID to be acknowledging the value of rural sites and beyond these challenges that are embedded in the dichotomy that we often produce by opposing the rural and the urban. We have to deal with the situatedness, and I anticipate there will be a lot of thought connected to the concept of situated knowledges, very important to Donna Haraway when it comes to the very importance, even in feminist science theory, to be grounded somewhere, rooted somewhere, in particular to have a kind of overview. And this is, I think, what Marta de Menezes wants to provide us with experiences both from her role and activities as the director of Cultivamos Cultura, but also from Ectopia, which is a structure dedicated to facilitate the collaborative work between artists and scientists. So beside her artistic practice, Marta has also curated a lot of exhibitions and therefore is probably in the best place possible to give us both an insight as an artist and a kind of overview as a cultural producer. So thanks for welcoming Marta de Menezes.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have to just say one thing. So thank you to Kapelica for having this. It is after 2 years of very hard pandemic, it's really a pleasure to be physically in one place and able not only to listen remotely, but to actually talk to people in person and laugh together, because it's always a little bit complicated to laugh remotely. And you all know, if you know me, you know that I enjoy laughing very much. It's a little bit simplistic, but it's for occasions like this that I do what I do, in the sense that this is definitely one of the major reasons for being happy being an artist and a curator and a producer, is that in moments like this, I can listen to these people talk and think, okay, this is what expands my mind. This is what's worth traveling for in a way. I am here to talk about cultivamos cultura, and in conversation with my team, I realized that you know my work as an artist, and you know a lot of the work of the artists that have been through cultivamos cultura, and some know cultivamos cultura mostly by the organization of events that we do, and some of you have been through cultivamos cultura, but you don't know the story, not the history, or maybe it's the history, but also the story of cultivamos cultura, and it feels just like Jan said, situated knowledge is a very important thing for organizing a contemporary art institution in a specific place, like a small village in a natural park, in the middle of nowhere, which is where the town of Sodobnih is. And so part of this presentation is about making sure that no matter how I very much contextualize myself and the work that is done in cultivamos cultura in the region, in the country, in Europe, and in the world. It is still done in a very specific place that is very different in character, with a gallery in the city, a laboratory in a research institute, and because of this, because it has its uniqueness, all of that nature of the space itself permeates the artworks that are done there. Not just the artworks, it permeates everybody that goes through there. And it's visible, or it's felt more than visible. It's felt by everybody who has been there physically. So this is an invitation for permanently an invitation for anybody who wishes to visit, to come and visit. So cultivamos cultura organizes activities in the areas of production, research, education, and exhibition. Of contemporary art, any field of contemporary art, not just biomedia. It's a part of our mission because we are situated where the community, the local community, is a very big part of our fabric. So we are inserted into a community. We are inserted into a community that has its history, has its characteristics, and has its value, and we are very happy for that. We are not floating in space, as some might think, and we host residencies for varied periods of artists, of researchers, scientists, very different fields, who come there to, mostly to experiment. And experimentation can happen in your mind, but it can also happen with your hands. So with the results of those experiments, with the results of that research, with the results of those moments that you dedicate yourself to organizing your thoughts somehow, or organizing your objectives, we feel the responsibility to share them, and share them again locally, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And this is why we do the activities that we do, and why at a certain point in our history it became important to come together with other institutions and start a project like Arc-hive, which is what's bringing us here today. So, I took the sound off, so you don't need to listen to the sound. But like I said, so we're in Portugal. We're in the south of Portugal. There's no major cities around. It's not very far from a major city, especially if you're from the US. But so 2 hours south of Lisbon, it's a protected area. We are, I don't know if I can't reach there. South from Cercal and up from Odmira. And even in terms of local policies for agriculture, for many things, it is a unique place as well. It's also a coast. The protected area includes some of the sea as well, which is important. And you have all of those characteristics that are important for us. There's a very nice and beautiful route that you can walk down the south, all the way to the south of Portugal. And it's, like I said, it's truly not a neutral place. You know that you are not in a MoMA. You know that you are not in Mat. You know that you are not in a gallery situation. Besides the landscape, which is very prevalent, you also have the community. And again, you know that you're not in Kansas anymore. In São Luís. São Luís is a very small town. I think it is 1,000 permanent inhabitants. It's typical of the south of Portugal. And it's a rural area in all of its beauty and strangeness sometimes, all of its quirks. And the community is very different from what it was 10 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 50 years ago, or 100 years ago. Actually, São Luís was probably one of the most flourishing communities in that area in the Middle Ages. It was almost a metropolis at that time, with the advent of the coast being more attractive because it's 13 kilometers inland, which is not a lot, but at that time it was a little bit. The coastal area became more developed, and São Luís started to decline in terms of population. And Cultivamos Cultura is there. In personal terms, well, let me just say also that it was an aging population at a certain point near the turn of the century, turn of the millennium, and it's no longer that. Actually, it's strangely an incredibly international community with people from all over the world moving into São Luís, and so many of them are artists. It's quite interesting. Our house is a farmhouse, which strangely enough is a farmhouse inside an urban town. So it's not a metropolis, but it is inside the village. It is a family house, and this is sometimes most people don't realize this. Is Cultivamos Cultura was created in a house that was the agricultural center of a prominent family in São Luís, which actually also is the family of my husband. So it's very personal for me as well, and it's part of it. It became an extension of me as well. I know I have memories of childhood in this farm when it was still owned and lived in. and primary house to Luis's grandparents. So it's sort of, and sometimes it's painful how different it is, and sometimes it's wonderful to see what it has become. It was an old family house. It may have more than 400 years as the structure that it is. But it was a home, and I think in character it remains the same. It is still a home. You can feel going through the house that it was a home, and it never stopped being a home. It's just not a permanent home for anybody. And so in that case, we decided never to change a lot. Actually, most of the furniture there was still the original furniture that came with the house when Luis's grandparents passed away. Because it was the agricultural center of the family, it has all of the infrastructure that is attached typically to a farmhouse. So they produced olive oil, they produced wine, they had pigs, they had horses, they had all of the land around where they had fruit trees or cork or grain. All of that material would then be stored in the infrastructure here. And I remember specifically jumping from the mezzanine to a pile of wheat on the ground floor at a certain point in my life. Now it's a little bit different. Health and safety issues were raised because there was no balcony to protect the mezzanine from the ground floor. And that was a little bit complicated if you're entertaining audience, and if there's no grain in the ground floor, some children could still try to jump. So there's been some infrastructural change. Also, the house has a new roof, and we keep on having to do some work. The barn that you see at the bottom image there, the roof is also completely new. The wood from the previous roof collapsed, and we still have some scars in the ground floor of that collapse. And there I have to say, our favorite exhibition space, because the works are done there, and exhibiting the works there is still the best place we can think of to show them. But we also have a field laboratory, or a mixed, a sort of a, it's not a mobile field laboratory, but it's a laboratory of close to the field. And we have some permanent artworks. We have a lot of memorabilia from the farm, from the family. We have the pictures from all of the family all over the house. And we host residencies primarily. So this is why we constituted ourselves. And because of this, one of the outputs of these residencies is that the artists leave something with us. And so our collection started to exist. And again, it's not a neutral collection, because even when the artists bring their own ideas, their own research, and their own projects, like Paul Venus did, where he did the first trials for labor, which he then exhibited at Ars Electronica. These prints that we did with a car in the garden of Cultivamos Cultura were tests. They were very important, I think, to start the project. But for us, we know whose sweat that is, yes, whose labor that is. We know that we ran around carrying roof tiles wrapped in saran wrap to make sure that the sweat would stay and absorb well into the t-shirts, and then would create a nicer print. So those kinds of informations are the ones that characterize our collection and give it richness and dimensions that sometimes you don't find in other collections. Because it's a personal issue for us. This collection is a personal issue for Cultivamos Cultura. But we feel having this collection that we have an obligation not only to the artwork itself, but to the artists that came through, to maintain it, to care for it, to make sure that it is kept, well documented, that it doesn't go into the ether somehow, or that it doesn't rot in a in a challenging room that is subject to moist and flooding and things like this. So it became very important to us to understand what does it mean to care for a collection like this. And it felt to me as an artist that we had the best tools to make sure that these works were kept in the best way, because this is personal for us, but also because the artists are alive. And we don't have to speculate on what the intentions of the artists were, and we can actually ask them, how can we keep, how can we document, what is the piece? And not just what are the objects that are arising from the piece itself. So we do exactly that. It feels to us that it's very important to show these works and actually, in a sense, decontextualize them. So even though our favorite space is our own space, which is what you see here, and some works cannot travel, like Kira's work or Andy Gracie's work, that is fine. How do you still make sure that the work is in existence when it dies, when it has a lifespan, when it has a life cycle, when it has an expiration date, when it has a degradation issue? How do you maintain a collection like this, and how do you communicate it? How do you give it a better life, and how do you create a more useful impact for this? So we have, besides our collection and our residencies, we have a program that involves 4 exhibitions a year in Portugal, 4 to 5 exhibitions a year internationally, some conferences, some talks, and this is also every time we show the works, every time we need to revive the works in a way, because they sometimes need to be revived because in storage they are in stasis somehow, gave us not the protocol, but the strategy to try and understand this. And the strategy that we took as our own was to ask the question, what is in an artwork? What is in each individual artwork? Because there's no standardization of this collection, as there is very little standardization in art, and I would argue that there's no such thing as standardization in art. So the key for us is to ask individually to the artwork and to the artist who's responsible for making the artwork, what is in an artwork? And from that question, we built each artwork a protocol for its storage, for its revival. What are the minimum conditions for the work to be exhibited? What are the ideal conditions for the work to be exhibited? With a compromise that we will always strive for the ideal, but very rarely do we achieve that. And this means a little bit, how do you proceed to decontextualize a work in a way? And for this, and because I won't last forever, and because the collection should outlast me, the question became important. This question became very important, and the archival of the potential answers for these questions became important. And so documentation became absolutely crucial. And documentation, I would argue that there's no such thing as bad documentation. Everything is valuable, though you do create a hierarchy of what is more valuable in terms of documentation. But I would say that for us, it's very important to, again, describe and try to document the piece contextualized as a start. And this is where we are starting. And that contextualization also means documenting the artist's version of what they are doing in Cultivamos Cultura. And so we started first, not just to document in terms of photography or video or any kind of output in terms of gallery plans or spatial plans of how the artwork would be shown, but also to try and record small documentaries talking to the artists, where the artist expresses specifically what they're doing in Cultivamos Cultura and a little bit of what the work is about. We then moved on to do also videos of the exhibitions and how the works were organized in space and how they communicate with each other. Because again, even within an exhibition setting, no work is alone most of the time. They're side by side to other works, and that also creates a level of interference. And lately, we've also been dedicating a lot of time of creating documentation that allows you to, let's see, I'll give you the examples later. Also, of course, it also started by trying to understand that our website is in itself a documentation, where every activity that we do has a post. And within that post, there's at least a small text of what each event is about, ideally with as much visual information and textual information of what it refers to, where is it included. We try to have documentation of what we are, where we are, information about the institution itself, information about the residencies, all of the exhibitions, and specific projects that we are, where we are partnering up with other institutions, and again, recontextualizing ourselves or contextualizing ourselves not only locally or very specifically in our own space, but in the field, in a sense. And this is also part of making sure that nothing is forgotten, in a way, that the information is there. It may not be relevant for a very long time, but if it's not there, it's never again going to be relevant. And partnering up with other institutions gave rise to Arc-hive, and these institutions are the ones that came together to develop this project that we are 6 months from completing. The first part, not completing at all. It's sort of like 6 months from beginning. And I'm very happy with what we've achieved so far, but I'm also very unsatisfied with what we achieved so far. So I think most of the time that we spent, we did a lot of things, and apparently our report impressed the committee enough, but it also feels that there's so much that needs to be done to make it better, not necessarily in terms of more things, but making the ones that we're doing now better. And so there's still a lot to do. The objectives of the project is ideally to create a platform, not ideally, it's going to happen, but to create a platform that is a tool or that it's usable by many different operators, from the individual to the institutional. We would very much like to try and create work criteria or standards or guidelines or protocols. Again, I have an issue with protocols as well. But I think the protocol needs to start, the protocol cannot be a set, a recipe. It should start with the question, what is in an art piece? And if it starts well, then the set of instructions that come afterwards, or tools possible to use for documenting any artwork, should be able to be made available and then chosen from by the artists themselves, ideally for me. Motivate and facilitate collaborations, add more users to the platform is definitely, I think, one of the objectives that we need to pursue. And we want to do it free of charge, in a way. So curating the collection at Cultivamos Cultura is about thinking, for me, it's about experimenting or exploring. It can be, so it's about creating new knowledge. It can be about methodologies. It can be about materials. It can be about conceptualizing. It is very much situated. It's situated knowledge, and it lives off that of knowing that it is situated knowledge. Whether you bring your own baggage, and we expect you to bring your own baggage whenever you come to Cultivamos Cultura, you will not be indifferent. You have the environment, you have the community, you have the weather as a factor of your immersiveness in a way. The permeability of ideas is present. Serendipity is also a present, and food, which is probably something that most people wouldn't put there, but we do. The results are surprisingly consistent, and this is why I say that situated knowledge is in itself a criteria. The exploration and the exploratory nature of the project is also a result, which is very, very important for us. The deepness of the knowledge, or the deepness of the research, is one of the results, which is also a very nice aspect of it. The reflectiveness of working in a place like Cultivamos Cultura, and the response to that immersion, to that situation, to that situated situation. But then we're doing a digital platform, and the question is obviously raised: why are we making all of this documentation digital? And I think one of the things that I affirm very, very strongly is that we are not trying to reproduce the works in any way, shape, or form, because there's no such thing. And I think of music a lot when I think, for instance, in selling my work, or when I think of making Arc-hive. When I was growing up, my uncle was a very big fan of classical music. And of course, I went to a lot of live concerts with them. My sister is a musician, so I had live concerts every day. And I was always very much aware that being in a place and looking at the artwork and spending time with the artwork itself is unreplaceable. The feelings, the sensations, the touch that the artwork gives to you is not substitutable. There's no VR experience that can substitute it unless the work is specifically developed for that. And that's what its objective is, or that's what its medium is. And so it would never be our objective to create a fake or a substitute for a piece, or to try and do an exhibition in virtual space. It's about thinking what is in an artwork and what are the documentation that we can technically produce that will allow us to understand what is in an artwork, not to experience it, but to understand. And so this is important for us. It's again, what needs to be made available? What knowledge is produced by something like this? How can a platform like this be used? What will it be used for? Who are the users for this platform? And how broad do we want them to be? This creates a lot of issues, of course, representation issues, characterization issues, new data collection. How do you interconnect the data? So something like today, this is absolutely fundamental knowledge for a platform like this. How do you put this into an online platform to make this knowledge that's produced by these people who have their experience, who have their own, how can we share today in a platform to be used by students, professors, museums, general public, artists? What does it mean? What needs to be produced from today in terms of, I don't know, texts or videos, or I don't know, what can be produced that will allow this knowledge to be available? And I'm not sure I know the answer to that, but we can try different things and see what works. There's a black slide there. And so for us, it means that we use the exhibitions that we organize as our opportunity to create that documentation and to challenge that. So ideally, we use the exhibitions in our own space as the basis, where the piece is contextualized in the environment that it was made in. And from there, when we do an exhibition elsewhere, it's important for us to see how what changes, what is necessary when you're decontextualizing a piece and recontextualizing it in a different environment with a set of artworks that will also inform the understanding of that piece. They will also transform the understanding of that piece. And this is where the curatorial texts and all of the images and information about each exhibition becomes important and relevant for that piece itself, because the piece has a life, and it travels and it changes, it transforms itself. And again, like I say, it's revived, or sometimes because it's moved, it's, the conditions where it's at a certain moment are not ideal, and it struggles to survive. So all of these need to be considered. And again, so this led us also to trying to start to create documentation in 3D that may allow us to follow a little bit of what changes, what degrades, what breaks, if we have 3D documentation of the work when it's set up for the first time, usually by the artist, and we have documentation of the time when the first time that the piece was exhibited in a new space, what changed? What transformation did the work suffer? And you have a history of what the work is and how it lived it's living its life. And I have to say, Nuno, who's here, is an amazing 3D rendering or protocol hacker, probably the museum would say, and Vienna, to try and produce, how deep can you go? How detailed do you want to be? And for each work, again, the question remains. For a work, sometimes for a work like labor, 3D digitization is not exactly the best way to document that piece. Maybe a very detailed scanning of all of the, almost going to the particles of carbon that are stuck to the paper can be interesting and important, but is it really what the work is about? And it may be important in terms of conservation of the work, because you want to have a history of how it degraded over time. If some of that carbon is loose and became lost, they're all framed, so lost in the sense that it's no longer in the paper and it's down at the bottom of the frame. Those things are important if you want to maintain what is left of the artwork that stays with us. But the artwork is not even the prints, Or a petri dish where a colony of organisms or varied organisms are growing and then die, and then the work needs to be reset for the next exhibition, and you need to make sure that you have the same organisms, or is it not the same organisms, and you just, how do you store the organisms? Where do you store the organisms? In what conditions do you store the organisms? For each piece, you have different answers in a way. The platform or the way we have the information collected by Cultivamos Cultura so far is like this. So each work has a different menu at the top. You have curatorship, and usually that includes information about where the work was exhibited, when it was made, and the context like that. You have a gallery of images. If the work, sometimes the works are need a deep zoom tool. Sometimes they need a 3D rendering. Sometimes, depends. Depending on the documentation that we have, we put it there. If more is necessary, more is going to be put there, and it's an ongoing project. It's not an end. Documentation keeps building. Every time the work is exhibited, every time the artist writes about it or wants to think about it or wants to revisit, new documentation needs to be produced. I would very much like to have, in some situations, something like this, where you have the prevalence of the artwork itself first, and then you have a menu next to it where you can access all of the extra documentation of the piece. But this is for me and Cultivamos Cultura, this is how we would like to show our works in our collection, which is curated in a very specific way. It's contextualized, and it should be thought of as a growing collection, but still a collection. It should be contextualized as well within the work of these artists, and these artists are some of these artists, most of these artists, all of these artists do work and exhibit in many other places, and the work that we have is a part of their body of work. And this is also something that should be present there. But I also think, and I think this is important, and this is, I think, what we need to discuss moving onwards, is this is Cultivamos Cultura collection, and this is a very direct approach for us. But the consortium, the group of institutions that were brought together with different objectives or with an ideal or an aim or a horizon, they need to be integrated with each other. And this is our challenge. You know, how I want ideally that any artist has access to these kinds of tools and how to. So not only the tools, but also how to create the documentation that they can upload their own collection or their own body of work into a platform like Arc-hive, and then index it so that it is connected to our collection or to other collections in exhibitions. Container has a whole history of artworks that would be amazing to have archived and documented, for me at least, in a platform, and how that knowledge and how the information can be integrated into each other will then help to generate knowledge, I believe. Thank you.
So thanks for both of your interventions. I will try to synthesize a little bit what has been said. Can you hear me? Yeah, so I think one of the first questions maybe to start with is in how far the issues of contamination, of loss are different from, let's say, digital media art, from conventional contemporary art as established in practices that already deal with archiving. And I digged out this manual from Applebaum from 2007, which is treating material aspects, non-material aspects, and always collects information about phenomena, then the source, the object, and strategies in order to qualify object-specific information and context-specific information. This is a classical technique. Then, let's say in a digital media platform such as the Matters in Media Art platform, there's a lot of criteria, and sometimes I wonder in how far the expertise that we gained in these digital archiving initiatives could be used and extended. But of course, there's always the artist, the title, the duration, description, key artwork information, so what you are listening as text information. So list of components, a qualification of media, display equipment, sculptural elements, packing and transportation related issues. What additional elements have been made in relation to the work for archival purposes. That is exactly what Marta has just talked about. Also, there's a category, let's say, in this media art platform archival system that asks what else is needed for the display of the work, description of how the media elements were made, a statement of significance by the artist, an assessment of the greatest risks, and also a risk of obsolescence of key display equipment or technologies, which is what we very often have in biomedia, of course. Then there is a risk associated with the deterioration of elements that is included, and a conservation plan. So, I mean, all these are relevant with regards to biomedia art. The question to both of us, maybe to Marta first, and you have been willing on this digital archive, and I think some of us mentioned, and you mentioned at the beginning, it doesn't make sense for you to make a virtual art exhibition. And for example, there is this media art databases such as initiated by Oliver Grau, for example, and he also asked me once, can you make a bio art virtual exhibition? And I said, well, That doesn't make sense to me. That's not the issue. I mean, it's precise on the presence. It's not about collecting this data and then showing images with related documentation and information. That's not an exhibition. It's about co-corporality. It's about restaging the real thing, the authenticity. But at the same time, this grid of the databases already has a lot of these informations because we are talking about biomedia art. And maybe there's a connection that is broader than we think. And I would like to elaborate with you on what are the criteria then that are lacking. I mean, and Oren and Jonat made already a significant input, and Howard as well, because Howard said, oh, I'm working with synthetic biology because there's already this iGEM, this registry of standardized biological parts. The problem is that, yes, if you can store it as formula, you have standardized biological parts. You have a chassis, you have a genetic sequence, you have metabolic pathways. But what about all the non-standardized things? And when I personally visited Paul Vanus for the first time, I think in the early 2000s at his home, he said something like, hey, I take you to my hard drive. And we went straight up to the fridge, right? And this was his backup. And the backup was a fridge full of enzymes, of primers and probes and DNA and so this was his hard drive. So of course there's a storage, the physical storage, there's a recipe, there's a documentation, there's text information. So what is so specific about and what needs to be extended when we move from the way that we are archiving digital or other kind of media art to biomedia art? What do you both think? What is missing in such established protocols that we have already at hand? Maybe you want to start, Martha.
Sorry, I started too early. Sorry. Fortunately, I started. So it is. It's a little bit different, but in many ways similar and familiar. And I think we've spent the whole day going from similarities to differences, and I think that's a very important dance to do. I can talk about the artworks that we have, and I have to say that I'm not sure if it was clear, but our collection is not only biomedia. It's a mixture of different medias, and this is why we start with the question, what is in the artwork? And what is in the artwork then dictates the protocol for storing it, for re-exhibiting it or reviving it, as sometimes with my biomedia it has to be. And depending again on the artwork, sometimes we need to have the specimens and the storage of the organisms in -80 if it's possible, and then revive them when necessary. We don't have a -80 facility. It's specialized equipment. But again, we do not work individually, and every time we use an organism that requires that kind of storage, we have collaboration with institutions that do allow us to use space for storing these kinds of things. For my own practice, this is not. It's an issue that I had to face from the very beginning with the butterflies. Every time you need to show this piece, you need to go to the lab that grows or that maintains this species as a model organism, and source the butterflies from there. And so this is the kind of strategies that I think institutions need to create to be able to do these things properly and according to. But it's not impossible, or it's not even that complicated. I would say that sometimes it's less complicated than with software companies or with hardware companies. I think storing an organism in a laboratory that is storing a bacteria in a laboratory that is a microbiology laboratory is not something that the people there will feel very challenged for. For my fly project, the one that I showed in Touch Me Festival 2020, right? We had 40 different varieties of Drosophila flies, and there are not that many laboratories that actually maintain 40 different strains of Drosophila flies. I am lucky that one of the research institutes that I collaborated with is one of the few in the world that have over 40 different strands, and I imagine that at some point it may become completely impossible to show that work, because unless you source the flies from multiple places. Again, those things are very important, and those things are some of the tools that need to go into creating technical writers specifically for these works. But at some point, there may be works that cannot be reproduced, which is where documentation even becomes almost more important. Not really, but sometimes it becomes more valuable for us just to make sure that they don't fall into the oblivion. And as an artist, I think this is very important. Do you want to comment?
Yeah, maybe we can prolong the question to ask what is not present in traditional archival methods for digital media art that you would like to be seen in a platform or an archival strategy that is needed for experiences that you have been facing over the last 20 years? What is missing?
It would be helpful. There were some parts of the questions that were not heard properly. So would you please repeat it?
Yeah, so the question was, with regards to existing archival strategies, listing the elements, the packaging, the risk factors, and everything about obsolescence that we have been already in the protocols existent from digital and media art, what are the specificities that you think are to be added from your cultural experience as curators and producers that are missing in such databases and such criteria?
Well, there is one thing that is it's one obvious thing that is extremely difficult to archive. And this is what we are actually talking about. This is life. So strategies of archiving life, we have two things that we can distinguish. So if we are talking about the archive as a documentation, or here we are talking about the archive as a collection. I mean, these are two different things. So as Marta said, if we are having artworks that may not be even able to be reproduced because the living matter is not available, there are no labs that have it, there are no labs that can store it, then the reproduction is not possible. But before we continue answering, I would like to ask Marta. Marta, if, for example, this happens and your work can't be reproduced again, so what would your artistic approach to that issue be? Because I think it's related to discussion, we can go further with it. But, you know, if there are no flies, so, okay, you said, okay, then we can engage documentation. But then it means that you actually don't have the work anymore, that you in a way killed the work and you are transferring it to a totally different media, and it ceases to be the artwork that was originally.
So the main artwork was that it was producing some kind of effect. So some kind of emotion that is totally coming from the fact that it's alive. So if, for example, if you expose dead butterflies, they're still going to probably transfer part of the message, but this encounter is not going to happen anymore in that sense.
Okay, so we talked a little bit about this throughout the morning, which is if we're talking about biomedia and an artwork that is alive, we have to talk about death. There's no such thing as life without death, and not necessarily as opposites or as opposing anything. It's just life does not exist without death, even infinite life, in the sense that even infinite life depends on nutrients that come from the death of others. So there's no such thing as life without death. Personally, it's a personal choice. Me as an artist, if there's no way to show the flies, because there's no more way of showing the flies, then you don't show the work. And in some ways, personally, again, and I'm not saying this is why I always start what is in an artwork, what is in each artwork. Personally, for me, and this is also the advantage that we have the artists alive, so we can actually ask these questions. We just need to decide which questions do we need to ask to make sure that we have at least a reasonable amount of information to be able to make decisions later on. For me, if you can't show the work, it's don't show the work. Don't show documentation in a physical exhibition of a work that you could not do. That this is the kind of, what is the minimum requisites for showing a piece? This is again, what is in a piece? The artist should be able to tell you what are the minimum requirements for showing that piece, what are the ideal requirements for showing that piece. And if those minimum requirements are not met, for me, I would prefer not to show the piece. But that doesn't mean that the documentation about the piece, and probably in a virtual platform, is less offensive to me than trying to create documentation about the work to show it physically in an exhibition, just to try and show something that is not the piece itself. If a piece includes documentation in it, and my Auntie Marta piece was done with part of the piece itself in exhibition is the documentation of the piece, then the documentation can in many ways be understood as the presence of the piece in the gallery space. That piece is me and Luis. Our bodies are that piece, and we've discussed this already. Since we're the ones who have the antibodies against each other, the piece is part of my body, and I cannot be in the gallery space all the time. Nor would I want to. So that piece is shown as documentation.
Here, because performance art has been going through this phase when it was discussed whether or not it should be a available situation or solution if somebody else would embody the performance, right? If somebody else can embody Marina Abramovic, if somebody else has the right to reenact the performance of somebody else. This was a huge series, for example, at the Guggenheim Museum, at the series in the early 2000s. We had all these questions about reenactment and how far the authenticity is concerning the very material level of the artist being present, the artist is present, or is the gesture of the presence and the performance being transferable into performativity to being reenacted by somebody else. What do you think? In this case, it has to be your cells. In other cases, it's HeLa cells, so they're generic cells. Very often, artists go to data banks. When Orlan wanted to make a hybrid skin coat, the Harlequin coat, it was evidently important for her that it was her own primary cells that were harvested through biopsy. But then when it comes to the other person to be matched with, or the other animal's cells were sourced from, because it was so complicated for ethical issues to get other cells to make a white-black skin mantle, she opted for cell banks. So there were generic cells. So how important is the presence of the bio-performer or the bio-performativity when it comes to the authenticity of the restaging for both of us?
Okay, I'm the one talking or no? Okay. So again, I think this depends on the work, and I go back to my question: what is the artwork? And I think this is a question that you need to pose to the artist. In some of my works, like the butterflies, I sold the piece to a museum, and part of the process of selling the piece was trying to understand what was the piece and what did I want the piece to be. And in this case, I went back to music again and thought of nature with a question mark as a sheet of music that can have interpretation. So I don't have an issue. So I have a set of instructions. The museum knows the source, where to get the living material from, how to maintain it and keep it alive, and the protocol, and even the storage of all of the manipulations that I did to all of the butterflies that I manipulated. But I don't have an issue with them hiring someone or having a volunteer come and perform the manipulations on the butterflies. And I see that a little bit like a piano, a musician, playing Mozart. It doesn't stop being nature, but it is also some of its authorship or some of its presence and experience will be modified, and it will be an interpretation in a way. Some of my other works, this doesn't make sense for me in the piece itself, and so it doesn't work. But you are absolutely right when you say it sort of makes me think of micro-performativity. If it's my cells, it cannot be other cells because the identity of the cells is part of the performative part of the piece.
So can we ask Olga and Sundisha what they think?
Becoming some other piece then, Marta. You can leave directions how they can perform it, but they have to find some kind of a partner that is for life and that they love. No, but what I wanted to say, I think we can learn a lot from performance art and from media art about archiving. These things are probably not that different. They have a lot of similarities. For example, if you have Tino Segal's work and the way he's selling it to museums is also a set of basically some rules and just the idea of the piece is somehow described not too complex and not too detailed. So these are some contemporary issues that probably a lot of kinds of art are dealing with. If we are talking about, for example, Namjoon Paik today, it's very hard to find all this equipment that he was using. Protocols changed, technology changed, so the way we are exhibiting today, Namjoon Paik is probably completely different, and I'm sure that artists in general would agree that it's okay to change some ways how they're presented according to the time.
Reenactment in performance is also something that shows, Marta, a few things that you mentioned. So interpretation, what can it become, and how can the presence of some kind of other author change the piece. We did a project some years ago when we reenacted historical performance pieces from Croatia, and the project was all about that. It was a vast project. We did not engage the original artist, but original artists worked with their replacements. Their replacements were either artists or so visual artists, performance artists, or actors. So mostly they were actors. And this is, so the theme of reenactment in performance is a very elaborated, and it is always also a question that it evokes, is this. So does this become other piece? Sometimes yes. So yes, and Marta, it depends, I agree with you totally about the artwork. It depends about how much the artist identity is involved. So it is an important question. And so how much life identity is involved? If we insist on life, life has also some kind of identity. So it has Marta's identity and her husband, lover's identity, their relation identity. Then this piece is not able to be reenacted in any kind of way on the cost of its losing its primer, authentic, effective energy. It can be envisioned that there is an extreme way, that there is the same couple as Marta and Luis, and that they have a same set of relations and issues and so on. But this is a speculation. But in a real artistic problematizing of this, so what is the difference, or what are the relations between biotechnological art and performance art, since they both share a life? Well, of course, it's different, because in performance, mostly, not only, but mostly, we are talking about authors themselves or other people, so humans who are involved. And biomedia, we are talking about non-humans, so there should be a distinction. There should be also something what I'm sure was mentioned by Jonat or Oron, that this relation to the other species becomes visible on another level, and that is so what is our main collective relation with other species. That could be also part, and something probably you talked about, philosophical aspects of how do we treat artworks that we want either to be collected or archived.
So let me challenge you both with a kind of very shitty question. I mean, there's a lot of talk about how to restore, Manzoni's artistic shit tins. If they leak, and so can we, restore as a conservation policy a Manzoni tin and just putting generic shit inside that? And is it important that it's his shit or whatever shit? And in the beginning, we are not sure that he was even shitting inside, and maybe not somebody else, and we don't know really what is in that. But since it's sold that way, we may restore it with the idea in mind that it has to be authentically identified, especially in the realm of the microbiome that was not that much around in discourse at the time. But now, as a counterexample, we have Wim Delvoye's cloaca machines. So generic shit from the beginning, there is no personhood in producing excrement, right? So you would be able to reenact, but Wim has resisted so far to replicate his machines so that anybody else could enact the machine. So the exception I think he did for the first time was for the Hobart Art Museum in Australia. But another thing, I mean, it's the opposite case, and maybe I will stop my challenge there. A good example of creating a database and an archive was initiated also by Billy Apple, and actually turning his own cells into raw material for artists so that they could work and immortalize Billy Apple's copyrighted cells, but made them available to the community, which means is to put the personhood behind the own cells to be proliferating as a resource to be used by others. So on how far do these examples challenge the idea that there is this kind of personhood that would be the main distinction when it comes to differences between archiving, biomedia art and performative arts? You want to start?
You need to wait for 2 seconds.
Are you suggesting to use Wim Delvoye sheet for Manzoni scan?
Idea. Quite expensive because this shit gets very pricey.
I would say that it needs to be an artist shit. Not just
I mean, what I like about the cloaca, that very often when you see it performing, that it's a performative piece, and people stand around and they applaud as the droppings fall, right? Something which is very, very usual in daily life. When a machine performing it, it's spectacular, right? So you have this cloaca machine performing and people standing around and applauding, and. Right, so it's a performative act. And so, yeah, what is this kind of personhood? But what I want to say is also that there's always a story attached to that. And this is why I this morning brought up the importance of paratext, be it epitext or paratext. That means narratives that fit into the story ex post, that have not been the intention, they are not associated with the work from the beginning. But in both your examples, I mean, that is present. You talked about the 2005 experience where I was there also with a flock, with a sheep. And when you pay attention to how you told the story, at least 60% of telling the story was how the public reacted and from whom you got reactions. So this becomes a piece. And I mean, a contemporary art piece would say, no, this is my piece. And what people think when they're standing by my painting, I don't worry about that. But in your case, it's a social experience as well. So the social interaction and the interaction between different kinds of biological organisms, like a kind of second order observation where one biological system observes another one, becomes a work. So this creates a kind of paratext, and this is fitting back into the artwork. And how do we conserve this? And who is deciding whether this paratext is entering the work? The reactions of press, of media, of other audience members, how this enters the work. And Marta, I mean, when we wanted to exhibit your butterflies in Nantes in 2003, my greatest frustration probably in this show was I had not green light from the organizers. It was not even a question of budget. It was because of the fear of the audience to actually associate casualties to causality. That means that because of the fact that the butterflies would be manipulated, they were prone to premature death. And that would have been, in the perception of an audience, the reason why you would encounter dead butterflies, right? And in order to avoid this expectation in audience responses, there was a kind, it was not censorship, it was just to say, this is a piece, and I didn't suspect, this is a piece they were most afraid. They were not very frightened about genetically modified organisms. They were not afraid about genesis. They're afraid of people coming to the gallery, seeing dead butterflies and saying, Marta killed them because they manipulated them and they are not natural anymore, right?
I received death threats for that piece.
But another question, I mean, and it's coming back to the paratext. I mean, I remember when you exhibited Deacon in Portugal, this kind of Mondrian replicate, I mean, with this kind of dyes that were prohibited by the European Union, with this azo pigments that were forbidden, degraded by extremophile bacteria that would clean up the painting, the modernist painting. But there's also this nice story when bacteria were escaping. I think in this art center, Le Petit Cabane, something like this. And so, in fact, when you encounter the work, you mostly encounter the work now via its narratives, via histories being told about that. So, both with relation to the flock story that you talked about, the Touch Me Festival in 2005, and the nature and the Deacon examples, how do you feel about the importance of conserving this external text that become crucial part of the work?
I think this is exactly what I've been trying to advocate for. I think it's very important. As an artist, I may start as inextricably linked to the work, but the work eventually becomes an entity in itself, and the work doesn't exist either without the response from the public. So I don't believe in saying that this is my work and I don't care about the reactions of the public, because this doesn't exist. The work itself doesn't exist without the interpretation from the public. And no matter how much, there's different levels of frustration, and some of them have been mentioned today. I suffer from the same frustrations as all of the artists who work with living organisms, is that they never do what you want them to do, and control is only an illusion. But even as an artist, before working with living materials, this was something that I had to face already. It never really worked the way I wanted to work, and I had to, I suppose, my strategy was to embrace it completely, in the sense that, very much like you said, the milieu becomes the fundamental part of the work. The setting of the conditions for life to grow are probably one of the most important things in working with life, because those are sort of like the tentative pushes for life to pose the question that we wanted to pose. But that question is never posed unless it's posed by the audience. So I see myself as creating triggers for questions that I want the audience to make. And it's not one question that I want the audience to make, it's a family of questions that I want the audience to make. And the better I make my triggers, the better, or the closest to the family that I want the questions to be made are made. And this is how I can improve my artwork. But again, it's not a one-directional relationship either. The piece is, in many ways, also the media, the medium between this relationship between the artist and the public, and so the narrative becomes everything. And there's no way of escaping it. And the more we know about even how that narrative changed, because that narrative is never the same, the better I think the piece is documented.
Addressing this question, of course, with regards to documentation and who decides what part of documentation is conserved or not. Is it the artist that say, oh, I like this reaction, but this reaction I don't like, so I include it from documentation. You know? There's always choices to be involved. But with regards to the flock piece in Zagreb, I remember this as well. And I mean, how would you say that you would document this piece? How much of the audience's reactions have to be present in the documentation of these external reactions of this paratext? And is it only about human reactions to it, or shouldn't we also investigate about the other sheep's reaction to the piece?
Yeah, we had, since it was a reality show, we had recordings from all the cameras, so that was the basic documentation. Then we had a website where people could interact, and some of those correspondences were preserved. Also, it was a viral piece, so there was a media response all over the world. And that's also only partly preserved because the agency that we were working at the time, so press agency that was collecting news, only did it locally. So this global response is only now saved in terms of our memory, or some articles that were referring to it in domestic press. But in terms of how animals felt, that's something that we don't know.
Well, I think so, but there was an interesting part on many levels, what happens around these kind of pieces. I mean, Yuri has, for example, huge experiences in this kind of media frenzy with Maja Smrekar, Oliver Kunkel, and other pieces. But in the flock piece, so we documented also not only all the actions that the other artists held for the sheep as part of the program, reality program, but also some other unexpected experiences. For example, so this was the time when reality shows were really popular here. And we had a visit from another reality show with people to a reality show for sheep. So definitely this should become part of the documentation of the artwork, as well as what would be interesting but hasn't been done is to follow what happens to the sheep that were not slaughtered. And most were not slaughtered because of the media. People felt remorse and sorry, so they adopted the sheep. Well, we know for one sheep, the winner ended up in my mom's place, where she had a place where she can offer the winning sheep, a very satisfying life, and he died by natural death. But
as Sunčica said, we have all kinds of pets thanks to biotech art.
But this is an important question for documentation and archiving. But I think this depends, this is the artist's choice. So we, as curators, follow that only to a certain point, but I think the artist should choose what becomes, as Marta was explaining, the context, the broader context, unintended context, and unintended narrative or extra narrative or unexpected narrative in artwork. I think unexpected narratives should become, because they show much broader response and the state of society. They should become a part of documentation or archive and should be documented somehow, because their meaning gives a very new boost to the artwork's life. And when we talk about memory and when we talk about narration and what is remembered from the artwork, so this should be balanced with, of course, artistic intent, but also to let's open it up to the facts that happened around the artwork. That might be helpful in a historical way, in a way of preserving, in a way of having memories about that artwork. And just a small detail about Manzoni. Well, it is really not important what is inside of, or if even something is inside, because he created enough presence, context, and narrative that only the conceptual part and the object part make complete artwork.
Question for you, if you can hear us still. That was posed somehow at the end of our presentation. It was kind of maybe a statement that this field that people that are involved in this field are maybe not working enough on creating protocols and standards to make it easier for other kind of institutions that are maybe afraid of exhibiting this type of artworks because they don't know what it involves, easier.
So we haven't entered a huge field.
And when we were thinking about why is that, the conclusion was it's probably the most boring part of the work.
Not only, I think it's opening to completely another mindset, you know, museological mindset. It's something institutional. I mean, if we talk about museum institutions, it's completely different mindset from most of us here, and I think we can talk about it very clearly. So, what is our relation? What do we think about that? Would we like to engage?
Maybe sometimes it's easier to engage as institutions to say, oh, like MoMA, I don't care so much about the infrastructure. Just let it clock and you make a nice media story. Is it a good way out to create a narrative? And a lot of, people have asked me as a curator, can we do something spectacular? And, isn't it freaky, So if the expectation is already to get a kind of freaky or quirky narrative, then it creates from the beginning the expectation of the creation of a paratext. But then the question becomes also who is filtering this paratext? Is it the artist to decide, I like this discussion and I like this reaction to it, I like this protest, but the other one I didn't like. Right? And is it the curator? And who is the gatekeeper when you collect that? And when you create a database, we not only know since Nelson Goodman that map making is world making, but the very criteria that you put up from the start are decisive from the way that the world is being made. So if you say that, it's a curatorial practice to actually integrate this into the art piece, or you let it up to the artist, it's a different bargain. Let's just take an example. Along when she's talking about how she produced the skin mantle, the Harlequin coat, never would take the anecdotes into consideration like I do. Right? I still strolling in the restaurant in Nantes in 2003, trying desperately to get a piece of black skin in this restaurant, right? And running around in this restaurant and cheating up people at tables, cutting their steak and asking them whether they can give a piece of their ass, and having a kind of biopsy done. And then coming back to the table and say, well, this guy was very nice to me and talking to me, but he couldn't actually participate in my project because this was the ambassador of Haiti. The slave state itself. And you get, as an artist, you come into this anecdotal situation where you ask the ambassador of Haiti whether he's giving you some black skin for your artwork. Right? But these are, in fact, contextual elements that are important. But they disappear, in this case, in the artist narrative because it doesn't fit the artist narrative. So why I ask this question is, how and upon which criteria do we decide who has a control over the archive? Because very often it's, the artist has to decide what's going in. But a lot of these narratives are created without the artist having predicted that. Even in Eduardo's case of the bunny wouldn't have made it to the headlines even there was this failure. So its failure became the actual success. And Eduardo's success is to turn the failure into a success, right? But then who decides what is a paratext to be conserved and which is not to be conserved?
Okay. So this is actually the comment that I wanted to make when Sushisa was talking. I am an artist, but I have to say I did a master's in art history, so that sometimes puts me into the art historian position, and it was drilled into me the importance of primary sources, and I'm a strong believer in primary sources, and this is why I think that now is the time to create documentation about these works, and not 50 years into the future where you cannot talk to the artist and do real interviews or real documentation about the intentions of the artist with the piece. But as I say, or as I think, the artist is not the only primary source, in the sense that the piece itself is a primary source, and the story of the piece comes with the narratives that are associated with the piece, and not necessarily the responsibility of the artist. And so again, this is why I say that, why I believe that now is the time to create this documentation, not just by asking the question, but by creating the story of the exhibition of the piece, and as much information as possible about the conditions in which it was exhibited, all of the context, all of the milieu in which the piece was exhibited. And I don't think we've discussed enough even here about how, because a piece is about something, but it's about multiplicity of things. And a lot of my works, for me, they're about something, but then they're included in an exhibition about nature, or they're included in an exhibition about genetic modification. And the butterflies have been included in exhibitions about genetic modification, and they're not genetically modified. So even the context of the other artworks that were exhibited together with that piece in that kind of situation builds a narrative for that piece, which goes beyond the intention of the artist. And that is still a primary source. And that still needs to be documented, I would say.
Do you agree, Sondicha and Olga?
We agree with the fact that narratives need to be made, and especially it's good if they're made while the artists are still alive, But the question is the artist the only one that is making that narrative, or also the curators have to be involved in that? And what is the position of curators in the whole process? I mean, probably not everybody is going to be precise enough, since some of the curators are going to make those kind of mistakes that Marta mentioned, including something that is tissue modified into genetically modified pieces. But still, I think there is a valuable, there are artists that are not taking care in that sense of their work. They want to do it, they're excited about making it at the moment, but documentation is not their priority.
Absolutely not. I think artists are horrible at documenting and even making any kind of they're hoarders, so most of the time they keep all of the documents, but they don't even look at them, and sometimes they throw them away. And they're horrible at making sense. That clearly not an artistic job to make the documentation in any way accessible most of the time. But I go into the science. Scientists are horrible about creating documentation about their own scientific work, or even contextualizing it in a broader sense. This is why we have philosophy of science. This is why we have theory of science as well, trying to keep up with that. We have communication of science. We have journalism. All of that is also part of documenting scientific progress.
Think about the right to forget. So, okay, you said these artists are horrible, but maybe this is part of the way they work. I agree. It's a problematic thing if we don't have documentation, especially for the theme we are talking today. But and as you said, you think this is part of the artistic job. I completely agree with you. But maybe there are artists and artworks that just don't need to be in this kind of reality. we are talking about archiving collections. So what do you think? Do artists have the right, do artworks or artists have the right to have such an approach to their work?
We're talking about art, so in art anything goes, right? So yes, right is the thing. Of course, they have the right to negate everything, and that's part of why art is so important. Is that there is that possibility always. I also think that in many cases, you don't do it because you don't have the habit of doing it, or you don't have the habit of making it available. But also as an artist, I feel the pressure to more and more contextualize the artworks that I did. From the very beginning, I could not talk about the butterflies without contextualizing them ethically, without contextualizing them scientifically, without anything like that. And so if I wanted to continue on showing that piece, or if I wanted to continue on my career within the scientific environment or the artistic environment, it became necessary for me to explain, and my mode of explaining is talking. So when I show a piece, I don't include a handbook on the piece next to the artwork itself. But when I talk about the artworks, most of the time people come to me and say, well, I never thought about that aspect with that piece because I never heard you talk about it. And so for me, that communication comes through, and it's not necessarily in the art piece itself.
Challenge of this for last time, and there was a question from the audience, so at the right moment also maybe to include reactions. But who is the gatekeeper when you create these archives, right? And what is the status of the artist being in charge or in power to control what is remaining and what not? And what is important in the story of the piece and was not? I mean, just a very interesting example, when curating Tour van Balens and Revital Cohen's show in Berlin about this kind of machine, or the actual transgenic, not transgenic, but sterile fish that were bred by a scientist in Japan, and to exhibit them as art objects. From the beginning we said, well, probably if you exhibit them just isolated in a kind of fish tank, there may be some protest, there may be animal activists, there may be somebody coming and saying you cannot do that. And then it came like that, and the veterinary intervened and said, well, you must exhibit the fish at least 2 in each fish tank, and you have to provide a shelter. And this is part of the piece, right? And then there was, attempt of the artist to actually not have any documentation of that, and to forbid photographs even in the gallery, not to show the 2 fish in the fish tank, because otherwise the exhibition would have been closed down. So the only images that circulate are in fact the authorized images of the artist, because they didn't want to integrate the narrative that it created. So the question here is, again, who becomes the gatekeeper? And is it a part of the work that the narratives enter it? Or do the artists have the right to say, oh, it stops there? And even if the work is to be challenging the audience, the way that the audience responded to my piece doesn't please me, so please don't document that. And where's the limits, and who is doing the choices? Where's the power of doing these choices when you create these art databases, right? And I think from the beginning on, this is a question to be asked, because it's, again, creating archives is a question of power. So
I see it is definitely a question of power, and I am a horrible as an artist. I'm a horrible documentarist, but I'm here also as a curator of Cultivamos Culturas collection, and because I feel the pressure of having the responsibility of maintaining that collection. We're not a museum, but we are an institution that is that owns a collection of artworks, and with our decision to own the collection or to have a collection, comes the responsibility of making sure that the collection is maintained, that the collection is conserved, that it's also our responsibility towards the artists that we keep their artworks in the best conditions possible, and that we make sure that they're not going to degrade over time or anything like this. So documentation is, I think, a very big part of this. Whether it's public or not public, this may be potentially a way of managing the gate, not necessarily the gatekeeper, but the gate, and maybe it can be an agreement with the artist and the curator and the keeper of the collection to decide what can become public, what is necessary to stay private, but those things should exist.
There was a question from the audience. I saw Jury first, then Erich, I think Howard as well.
Yes, I believe that the question of archiving works that are using biomedia is a highly political question. Why? There are so many protocols that are using scientific findings and scientific expertise and technical expertise that we who are observing the artworks, either other artists, curators, our audience, we are left there only to believe that what we see, it's what we see. So the documentation has to be done. Why? Because biomedia is bringing to art field something that no other art practice is having. No other. It's a total privilege, and I think it is a civilization achievement. It's what we were talking this about all day. It's alive. It's life. Life as an object. I promised my colleagues to write a preamble about why this name of a symposium, because it is not meant that life is an object as it would be an object of color, of material, of whatever palpable that artist or whoever can skillfully work on. I took the term object from theoretical psychoanalysis, where beside the classical psychoanalytical objects like breast and sheet and so on, and Lacan added also sight and sound, I found this metaphor not to objectify life, but to show that this is a missing object. You can never put a finger on that because it's supposed to be there, but it's not. No? So whatever we do, we are alternating around it. We can come closer, but and also far. Now, in an artwork where there is a phenomena of life, nobody can claim ownership on that. So we cannot talk about this artwork entirely as an ownership of an artist. We can talk about narrative and visualization and objectification. This is what you were saying, Marta, before. But there is something that can't be included. No? we had one recent, or we have several experiences, where we were contemplating about restaging the artwork. But from various reasons, we found that quite difficult because the context constantly changed. And that is bringing us to reenactments. So far, all the reenactments in performance were kind of farce. It was repeating somebody else's story. While here, in this case, you can't repeat life. It's always different. It's always another thing. You can, instead of reenact, you can appropriate in a way that it becomes collective. What I have in mind as a case here, it was in one artwork that we also produced. It was of Charlotte Jarvis 2 years ago, where it's an ongoing artistic research and also hopefully it will be realized in a form of an artwork. When she brought her stem cells, then she cultured it to a higher level of tissue, but in order to maintain that alive, she needs some media, some serum. But instead of using bovine serum, she invited other people, not only artists. It was a form of, it was not even a workshop, it was more a gathering, so to say. And on her, because the artwork stemmed from the fact that she wants to do a female sperm, she asked female attendees of the workshops to donate their blood. They synthesize serum out of it, and they feed the cells, so it became collective sperm. So maybe appropriation is not the right word. I had one word which is better, but I forgot it. But if you want, I just wanted to point that out, that there is not authenticity, it's autonomy of life, of this missing object. And it brings a call to participate or to adopt. Maybe adoption is a better word. And this is where radical care is coming in. Yeah. So, and this is why it's so important to assume the responsibility when we are dealing with living matter. It is not just responsibility in front of law. It's bigger than that. So I believe that we need to establish a different understanding that is not fetishizing the form of artwork, but the agency that everything included, including artwork, brought us there, to experience this magic of life.
Thank you, Yuri. I think that's very important, and this is, I think, why I ask the question that I ask is what is in the artwork, and not what the artist wants from the artwork or anything like this. I think the first question is not necessarily what the artist wanted or what the artist's intentions were, though that's a very important question. I think the first question is what is in an artwork, and I've played with the idea what is that artwork. I didn't sound so good, but that's what I mean. It's the artwork is the focus in a way. And as the author, it's absolutely fundamental that the author is there, but the artwork, as you say, is an entity.
Thank you very much. Yeah, discussion was really interesting and very many parts were brought up. I'll be short. I really was surprised by positively, because I was never thinking about the right to forget in the context of an artist, because normally it's the wish to be not forgotten, the wish to be remembered. Yeah, but it brings me to another thing which we experience very often, which is actually cultural amnesia. And I think that a project like Arc-hive is, in that respect, really important, and that we are actually, within ourselves, are able to kind of participate in writing our history. And also, when Jens referred to the gatekeepers, and I mean, it's a strange term because it is but yeah, there are there are gates in place, of course, but when we are able to kind of provide diverse information from let's say, from curators, but from the artists as well, and from others which we are working with, then I think that there is a good kind of raw material at hand to work against cultural amnesia. And I think we heard in the morning a really interesting example why this is actually really crucial to work against that, because amnesia is not only being forgotten, but maybe also being completely reinterpreted and instrumentalized. Like, for example, Oron's example with victimless leather, where the cultural amnesia basically was turned into favor of commercialization and as such. So yeah, this is why it's important as well. Thank you.
Hey. Really interesting and really difficult topic, archiving. There's a couple of things I just want to take out of it, intentionality, and trying to differentiate that between what intentionality is and what is in the work. I think that's a great question, and I think you answered it in part, but I'd like to unpack it more with you. Maybe not right now, but then part of extinction as well of an artwork. I think that can happen. Maybe not right now, but if your -80 breaks, that could be a destruction of that hard drive. Something to think about as well. But what I wanted to try to, and maybe there's something to do with something we could learn from seed banks or this kind of strategies, conservation strategies that happens more ecologically as well. But what I wanted to ask was how you're going about this right now in the work in your archiving. So right now, are you capturing it looks like you're capturing the process, but I just want to hear a little bit more how it's being captured at the moment and to what extent, and maybe what you might want to expand on.
Okay, I wanted to say before, and I think now it's also a good time to say it, which is in archiving and documenting, you're always lacking. Okay, and this is part of the game in a way. As an artist, you're always lacking anyway. So it's also part of the game, and you need to deal with that, and it's how you face it that makes a difference, I think. So for us, I think it's very clear, and the members of my team who are here will probably say something similar, is it's never good enough. It's never well done enough. It's never even properly done. But it's a beginning, which is more than was there before. There's a lot to learn, and this is why I think the partners came together, and we came together, but even when we came together, there was a myriad of other institutions that somehow felt right to be also included into this discussion. And this is why I feel that the platform is beginning only when it becomes public, because this is the moment where it can actually become a part of the community. And the community is much broader than these 5 institutions. But I think it was, again, a beginning. And I have to say that one of the most amazing things that I think we've achieved was that the beginning was also made with the Museum of Natural History, and not just contemporary art or new media art institutions. Because for us, at least in Cultivamos Cultura, this was important knowledge that we could learn from an institution that does a lot of documenting and archiving of a collection which is so immense that it's difficult to grasp, and they conserve it to the best of their ability. And it's always, from what I experienced when I visited, is always a fight against the inevitable in a way. Yes, degradation, death, putrefaction. Even in inert materials, there's always oxidation, chemical reactions. There's always something that goes wrong. And you try to, viewing the storage of the collection and how anti-fire systems are in place, things like this sort of really makes you a small collection in the middle of nowhere, trying to do our best in making sure that the organisms are maintained, that the pieces don't fall apart even when it rains, or when a fungus just suddenly breaks and attacks every piece of wood that you have in the storage. It makes you feel very humble. But this is, again, archiving. It's an aim, but it's not even the only issue. Is then BioArt Society are doing a part that I think is very important, which is, how do you document methodology? How do you create new documents for methodology of practice in the field, in the lab? Because this is also, it's archiving not just artworks, but a field. And the field is made of more than artworks. So how do you archive the way teaching is done? Because this, I know that now this is difficult to deal with. I know that I am mentioned every year in the classrooms of the art school that I went to. And I have no idea how they refer to me. But again, this is how art and biology, or biomedia, is being taught at the Academy of Fine Arts in Lisbon, which is inconsequential, but maybe not. How do you document the teaching, the understanding, the impact, again, the history of the field itself is important. I think this is what I can say.
I like a lot what you said about the seed bank as in comparison. We had a conference in Paris about that when the Swiss Cultural Institute organized the conference about seeds and soil. So the soil is important because it's a medium, it's a milieu for the seed that apparently just can be transplanted everywhere. but it's important that it's being transplanted. And that's why I started my communication this morning also with George Gessert, saying that the actual seeds is not the artwork, it's not the outcome, it's the fact of scattering it that is the art practice. And there's a lot of criticism about the seed banks, for example, in Spitsbergen or Svalbard, about this wall, the seed vault, being just a genetic archive because the sterile conditions will make it impossible for the seeds ever to grow. So it becomes a kind of repository for big companies and genetics. It becomes a genetic archive, but not something that is comparable to South American seed communities which exchange seeds in order to regrow them and cross-fertilize them, which is different. This is a living archive, and the seed vault is a sterile, dead archive, right? So there was a question over there first, from the standpoint of natural history or museum practice perhaps, and this is maybe linking into this discussion about the art to be regrown and only at the practice being something worth to be collected. So just maybe...
Thank you. Yes, I work at the Natural History Museum in Brussels, and I'm really glad that we are part of the Arc-hive project. Indeed, it's very interesting for us. We, as Natural History Museum, indeed, we have lots of protocols, lots of rules and things that we implement both for our collections, handling, the curation, for the maintenance, for collecting on the field, for how we display the specimens in the galleries, how do we interact with the kids coming and trying to touch and learn from these. So there are many protocols and research protocols because we go in the field, we collect, we indeed curate and then display and then try to maintain this collection. 38 million specimens, all of the kind, zoology, anything you can imagine, from dinosaurs to coleopter. So it's quite a whole machine, a process within the research field. And well, I'm also a partner of an artist, and I know what it is to be an artist and not to be really bad by documenting and telling what it is that we're doing as an artist. So listening to the discussions so far, my question now is within bioart. Now I understand that there is the artistic field where there is this magic and this creative part, which actually, to my understanding, is maybe not to be told, because it's something that is immaterial, that is abstract, that comes from the artist and that is there, like improvisation in music. You rarely have the artist explaining what he's doing and how he proceeded to lead to that piece of art that is there or that is now vanished. So in that respect, I don't think we expect anything to be explained. While in bioart, maybe now I understand that it's really a process, like a research process, which now is trying to have its own rules and protocols and explanations and documentation to how to do this and how we led to this piece of art, to this performance. But here I think our questioning and our difficulty is also to see how to capture and keep in the same time the creative part. How to document, but also, because it's bioart, to keep this evanescence, this vanishing thing. And this is our challenge within Arc-hive, to my opinion. Because otherwise, we're going to fall back to the research protocols and the whole process if we really want to encompass and describe with scrutiny what is going to happen and what is happening or what has happened. So I think we should be careful not to, to really with Arc-hive keep this specificity of the art part, which is the evanescent part, and the difficulty will be to communicate about that, but with maintaining and keeping it as something that is artistic still. I don't know if I'm being clear here. So yeah, it's a question, but
I'm not sure if I am understanding, but I see Arc-hive, if it was an art project, yes, that would be definitely something that I think would be important to maintain, but I don't see Arc-hive as an art project. I see it as an attempt to ask the question, what is necessary in terms of documentation of these kinds of works in this kind of field, and how can we make sure that the data that's being produced as documents is then integrated to each other. Yes, so whether it is the Cultivamos Cultura collection and all of the documentation that we're producing about that, and we have different kinds, and for instance, we even have links of interviews or that have nothing to do with our collection of the artists talking about the work in a different context, but we can sort of, the artist was talking about this work within this context, and this is documentation about this work. You know, how then can I relate this to Solo's documentation about methodologies? How can I connect that to the publication that is being prepared and all of the reflection materials? How do I connect and integrate the collection with what we're doing here today? How is a number of items which are already semi-organized, how can that also be interconnected and become something more than the sum of its parts? Maybe this is also a little bit of that evanescence magic that becomes something else, which is a little bit inexplicable. We can provide a beginning. I don't think we can provide anything else but a beginning, and the thing, again, a little bit like an artwork, will grow into itself, hopefully. Thank you.
It's a very big pleasure to be part of the conference, and it was nice seeing you all. It would be even nicer if we could see everybody in the audience, but it was great, and I hope we will be able to meet in person very soon.
So yeah, we are leaving the stage and leave you with your realities, and hope you will have further very fruitful discussion. So thank you all again, and bye.
Bye.
I just wanted to add a bit to Marta's answer to your question. Don't
look at me.
For now, we will always be saying this, we are just scraping the surface. My hope, or our hope, is that somewhere in the future, we one day wake up and look back and we see, oh, okay, we can see some structure of organized structure of digitizing an art piece, and that doesn't appear all of a sudden. At first, we just took photographs and measurements, and now we are setting the stage to make a 3D time lapse of development of bioart. And when we reach that stage, we will want something more and more. For now we have 3D models and videos, and when we have 3D time lapses, I will be saying the same with the same type of. Yeah, it's not the same. We will always want more with more quality, and that's from the technical side. Looking at it from the ontological side of what will we document and what we will write about. That's always, and that's a bigger challenge for me, but that's always something we have in consideration, and we, together with Jan and the rest of the team, we discussed a lot about each piece. As Marta says, what is the piece? And we apply that to every piece. It's exhausting, it's fun, it's... me and Jan have a lot of discussions. Like I always take the side of the technical. Like I look at the object of an art piece, and it's very hard to distinguish what's the object, what's the art piece, what can, shall, or would need to be digitized. And it's like a dream. You almost touch it, but never really. So it's hard to define that. And besides, or in parallel to the technical developments that we also have to take in consideration, 50 or 100 years ago, our archive could not be done in the same way. But now we have different technology. We have the websites are becoming more powerful. So we should not fetishizing technology, but take it and use it in the best way. So we are also trying to improve our archive along with technology. But what I was saying, parallel with that, the ontological side of each art piece, it's also a bit of a challenge and a fun one, I think, because I don't think, unless the artist comes and says, no, you're wrong, there's not a big straight red cross line that makes us completely on the wrong side, because also most of the artists are live and we discuss with them, and when they produce the art piece, they are with us in Cultivamos making them. So I think it's difficult for us to be completely out of hand, and it's a fun challenge to develop it.
Yeah, can I respond as quickly as I can? There's one thing that strikes me that is special with how you're doing it, where you are, which is that it's all site specific. That changes a lot of the things around the archiving process, and there must be something quite special about that. That you're probably thinking about as well, because it's part of the environment, the soil, the place, and you have all you're with it, you're with the process, so you're actually partaking in it as well. So there's something quite special about that, I guess.
I haven't said anything to Nuno yet, and I don't want him to have a heart attack this moment. But I discussed with Vienna that we need to digitize Cultivamos Cultura.
I was going to take the opportunity to add that, because we discussed.
You told him?
When it's I think it's I can have a little bit of fun with language. When you said it's site specific archive, it is in two ways, archive of our collection is site specific in two ways. It's site specific because it's about the collection made on or based on Cultivamos Cultura, but it also site specific because it's the archive website. So we are not archiving to present it in somewhere else. We're archiving it especially for that specific place. Yeah. So taking part of the two. And what Marta says is that you are watching the objects in 3D, but in a vague place, in a some environment that it is used to provide lighting. And one interesting thing would be to digitize, or for you to see indirectly Cultivamos Culturas environment. For example, if we digitize the place and we have the 3D reconstruction of it, we can use the lighting of the place and the proper reflections and angles and everything. So even if the object is presented with a blank background, the right white balance or the right lighting and shadows, that's not really super important ontologically, I think, but it had something more. It's another step to reaching. Well, I run out of adjectives because truer is not the real the real word, but to reach something more than just, for example, the object that you saw on Marta's presentation. It was Leiten, provided. It was lit with a 360 image that I used because it's one of the ones that I had. But I think it would be better if it was that 360 image was recorded on the place it was first exhibited.
And that just as the beginning, because of course then the piece is shown in many different spaces. And so you would ideally have the option to then follow how those spaces interact with the piece itself.
Any more questions? What is the mood in this room? How about your patience and passions? Any more questions? Jury, I don't know what the timetable was.
We are bored over our timetable, but it's okay. We are ready to close it up. We are here for...
Okay, so let's stop. Let's metabolize, right? Okay. So do you want to conclude, Jury, today?
Yes.
Go home.
No, you are staying. We are continuing tomorrow at 9. We have the third slot, Learning from Others, where we will listen 3 speakers. It is Barbara Borčić that will present their efforts, how they conceptualize and then try to archive and historicize video artworks. Then we'll hear about the digitalization of artworks from Ida Hirschenfelder, and Rob Weber will talk about the same problems that he was trying to solve for archiving dance and other performative practices. Thank you for today. I think it was super interesting. It is still a lot to be said, but this is why the European projects are. No? So we'll keep kicking. Thank you for coming, and hopefully we meet us tomorrow again.